Do you know that you know that you know? It's okay if you don't know. It's okay if you're not 100% certain of your salvation. The following is a parable from Jesus. There was once a rich man who wore fancy clothing. He lived each day in luxury. At the entrance of his estate lay a homeless man named Lazarus, who was covered in sores, longing for food, hoping the rich man would give him something to eat, anything. As he lay there, slowly dying, dogs would come and lick his open sores. One day, the poor man died and found himself reclining next to Abraham at the heavenly banquet. When the rich man died, he found himself in the place of the dead. This parable describes two types of people, rich and poor, healthy and sick, sated and hungry, oppressed and those who oppress. One of the men goes on to experience life while the other goes on to experience death. This parable pushes modern interpretation of salvation to its limits, and then it goes and throws it away, as do all of Jesus' parables. If you pay close attention to the actions of both men, neither follow the rituals or customs and traditions that the modern church preaches today that we have to do in order to get into heaven. Lazarus does absolutely nothing to become a Christian, yet he finds himself in the heavenly banquet. He did not acknowledge Jesus. He did not acknowledge the crucifixion. He did not invite Jesus into his heart. He didn't ask to be forgiven. He wasn't baptized, and he probably didn't go to church or read his Bible. He did absolutely nothing. The same can be said for the rich man. However, for some reason, the rich man ends up with the dead. The rich man is not portrayed as committing any sin. As far as the story goes, he is not an adulterer, a thief, a murderer, or did anything inherently evil. The only thing the story tells us about the rich man is that he is rich. And that's it. The only thing the story tells us about Lazarus is that he is poor, ill, and hungry. And that's it. Notice, Jesus, when telling this parable, didn't care whether or not Lazarus or the rich man believed in his existence. He didn't care if they believed that he died on the cross for their sins. In fact, Jesus is telling this parable before he is crucified. In fact, Jesus tells all his parables before his crucifixion. Also notice, Abraham is at the heavenly banquet. Abraham didn't believe in Jesus. He didn't accept Jesus into his heart. He didn't believe Jesus died on the cross for his sins. And yet Jesus himself says that Abraham was at the heavenly banquet. In fact, Jesus never mentions himself in the parable. Jesus doesn't find himself necessary for Lazarus to join Abraham at the feast. Now, you can't just shrug your shoulders and ignore this. Now that you see this, don't look away. Of all the words you choose to ignore within the Bible, do not ignore the words of Jesus, especially if you call yourself a Christian, a Christ follower. So what is Jesus saying in this parable? Well, what he is not saying is that being rich is a sin. What he is saying is that sin is not just what you do, but what you choose not to do as well. Sin isn't just the presence of an evil act. It is also the absence of a good act. That's why the rich man didn't go to the heavenly dinner party, even though he hadn't done anything inherently evil. The rich man had the resources and the ability to help Lazarus. He could have healed his wounds, fed him, or simply acknowledged him. Instead, the rich man kept his wealth to himself. He didn't have the heart to spend a dime on the man dying right outside his home. There is no doubt the rich man saw Lazarus suffering. He passed him every time he entered or left his home. I'd like to mention again, the rich man did not go to the place of the dead because he didn't say the sinner's prayer or because he didn't accept Jesus into his heart. That needs to be very clear. Lazarus also didn't accept Jesus into his heart. If that was so important or even slightly necessary, Jesus would have mentioned it. But he didn't. Because what's important here is not superficial rituals. What's important is our behavior and our actions. There is nothing more important to Jesus than that. Nothing. Think about this. I'm going to change the parable just slightly, all right, so that you can understand what I'm trying to say here. Just imagine if the rich man said the sinner's prayer and did accept Jesus into his heart, but continued to refuse to help Lazarus. The rich man would still have gone to the place of the dead and not to the heavenly banquet with Abraham. Do you get it now? Because what matters to Jesus is not what we say or believe, but how we treat others. The parable makes it more than clear that our actions make us Christian, not our words or belief, whether or not we go to church or read the Bible or listen to Christian music, or not getting tattoos or piercings, or not drinking and smoking. No, rituals do not get us closer to God. However, taking care of one another does. Do you know that you know that you know that you're saved and are going to heaven? That is the most narcissistic question I have ever heard. Being 100% certain that you're going to heaven doesn't get you into heaven. It only amplifies your ego. Faith is not about being certain. Faith is about having doubt, and in that doubt, continuing to follow Jesus. In fact, certainty is the opposite of faith. What good is certainty in your salvation if your salvation doesn't change the way you view or treat your neighbor? If you care more about your salvation than you do about the oppressed, then you're not saved. Sin has nothing to do with doubt. In fact, sin has everything to do with your arrogance in believing that you deserve heaven. Why is faith even necessary if you're 100% certain? Do you think Lazarus knew that he knew that he knew that he would join Abraham at the banquet? Of course not, because Lazarus wasn't thinking about God or Jesus or heaven or salvation and all this religious stuff. All he could think about was surviving another day. All he could think about was where he could get food or shelter. The deciding factor in this story that Jesus tells are arrogance and humility. It has nothing to do with believing in Jesus. Now, if you truly understand the teachings of Jesus, then you would understand that they're all about arrogance versus humility, selfishness versus selflessness, greed versus generosity, injustice versus righteousness, good versus evil. All right. To truly believe in Jesus is to pick good over evil and live a life that bears fruits of good actions. Okay? To truly believe in Jesus is to use your abundance to help those that lack without questioning if they deserve it. All right? Did Jesus question the 5,000 before he fed them? Of course not. How can you say you believe in Jesus when all you do is say Jesus is Lord? Or all you do is say, I believe in Jesus, but your actions don't reflect that declaration. You get upset when I say being a Christian is more than just believing in Jesus, even though I provide more than sufficient biblical evidence to support my claim. Why do you get so defensive when I say God is more loving than your doctrine of eternal punishment, when the only God Jesus ever talks about is the one that transforms life and not the one that destroys life? Why do you waste so much time arguing a meaningless discussion about which religion or denomination is more correct? All you care about is being 100% certain that you have your ticket into heaven, while you completely ignore those suffering right in front of you. Does that sound familiar? Your arrogance is astounding. How can you accuse me of being a heretic or preaching a false gospel when your gospel prioritizes self-gratification over the well-being of others? Let me break that down for you. Your gospel prioritizes you getting into heaven to get whatever you want, to experience paradise, before it prioritizes the well-being of those suffering here and now. That does not sound like the gospel Jesus preached and lived. How can you not agree with me on that? Have you even opened a Bible? You cannot criticize me for that. How can you say you know God when all you preach is an eye for an eye? They get what they deserve. That's what you believe, and that's what you preach. They're going to hell because they deserve that. That's exactly what you believe. Have you even opened a Bible? Jesus says it very clearly. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth only encourages more evil. Leave revenge for the wicked, because righteousness can only be taught by demonstrating it. And I bet you everything Jesus demonstrated righteousness. And He is God, and God demonstrates righteousness. God does practice what He preaches. I guarantee you that. Okay. How can you not see that? But can I blame you? Maybe you're just brainwashed, and it's not your fault that you can't see it. The parable of the rich man and Lazarus teaches that how you treat others here and now determines your future. Right? The only thing the rich man was judged for was how he treated Lazarus. That's it. Right? There's no other rituals or doctrines in that. It's simply, how did he treat his neighbor? Well, he didn't help him, even though he had the power to, and now he's with the rest of the dead and not at the banquet. All right, so enough with your immature and weak sermons that have nothing to do with freeing the least of these, of their chains of oppression. Did Jesus save Himself? No. He welcomed His crucifixion in order to save those abused by their oppressors. Jesus requires His disciples to do the same thing. Now, do you call yourself a disciple of Jesus? Can you live that type of life? If not, then shut your mouth and stop saying you know anything about the Bible. Definitely stop calling yourself a Christian, because all you're doing is perverting the name of Jesus and everything He lived and died for. It's funny how those who can't see Jesus as anything more than just a guy who hands out tickets into heaven, those people are all privileged individuals who have never suffered a day in their life. That's why they can't empathize with the outcast, marginalized, or refugee. It's so easy for them to look the other way while society takes advantage of those people. Now, your apathy doesn't rid you of society's sin. It makes you just as guilty. If you're not helping the oppressed, then you are encouraging the oppressors harass them. Your head is stuck up so far up your antichrist theology that you can't see that you are encouraging the church to be a club for the privileged instead of a safe haven for the broken. Yes, I am a little upset that Christians are using Jesus as an excuse to oppress others. Why aren't you? Yes, I am sick and tired of pastors and churches wasting everyone's time on rituals and traditions that have nothing to do with helping those suffering right here and right now. Why aren't you? Instead of criticizing me for prioritizing the teachings of Jesus and encouraging others to love, heal, and free people of their oppression and suffering, why don't you criticize yourself for not doing the same thing? Criticize yourself for preaching and propagating a gospel that does not offend the rich and the powerful, and that does not protect the poor and the needy and the powerless and those without a voice. What are you doing? You can continue to criticize me, or you can join me in criticizing the corruption of the church.